Before I tell this story, let me ask you something small. Where are you listening from? From windy Texas, quiet Ohio, the lighthouse shores of Maine, or all the way up in cold Alaska? If you can, leave a comment. I have always liked knowing which corners of America my stories manage to reach. At this age, you look at a map differently. Not to brag about where you have been, but to see who your journey still manages to touch. My name is Nathan Hale. I am 56. My entire life has revolved around ship engines and steel, heavier than most people's hearts. I am a senior marine propulsion engineer, which in simpler terms means I design and optimize propulsion systems for large vessels. Like a cardiologist, except the heart I keep beating is made of alloy and runs on magnetic force instead of blood. For more than 3 decades, my whole career lived inside machine shops that smelled of oil and river wind right along the Willamette in Portland, Oregon. People like to say Portland is a city of coffee, craft beer, and odd souls, but to me, Portland is the sound of metal striking metal at 6 in the morning when the shop doors roll open. It is the echo of ship horns drifting in from old piers that have survived generations of couples who carved their initials into them. I am the quiet type, steady, meticulous. Co-workers say my jokes land dry as dust. I deliver the punchline with a straight face as if nothing was ever said. They are not wrong. When you work with engines that weigh more than your car, you learn to ration your words. Steel never lies, but it will fail on you the moment someone cuts corners by a few millimeters. I am no genius, but I have principles. Any design that lands on my desk, no matter how small, has to earn my confidence that it will survive out there on the real ocean, in cold wind and high waves. Maybe that is why I built MagnoDrive, a magnet-based bladeless propulsion system. Quiet, low vibration, nearly 40% of fuel savings. And more importantly, it helped both commercial fleets and government vessels cut operational costs. That technology anchored a long line of defense contracts that this company still leans on. But I am not saying this to brag. I am saying it so you understand what truly happened that afternoon. It was a Monday. Portland was doing its familiar damp routine. The rain was too light for an umbrella, yet heavy enough to miss the windshield. I was called into a meeting with the new chief executive officer, Veronica Lake. Her name sounded like an old Hollywood star, but the resemblance stopped there. She was in her mid-30s and came from the world of corporate restructuring, the kind of person who does not care what makes a ship move as long as the cost chart looks greener than last year. I do not dislike people like her. The world needs them. But I have always believed folks like that should stand a few feet away from an engine. Too much heat, too much risk of something blowing when you least expect it. I stepped into her office. Wide, sterile, bright enough to make you think dust had been vacuumed out of existence through sheer confidence in quarterly reports. She stood with her arms crossed, her expression tight, as if she had just finished a calculation she did not enjoy. The first thing I noticed was that she would not meet my eyes. Someone who has been an engineer as long as I have learns to read signals. Avoiding eye contact means one of two things. Either they want you to do something you do not want, or they are about to take something you already have. Nathan, she said softly, like a notice slipped under a door. We are restructuring. Positions that do not align with the new direction will be streamlined. I did not flinch, did not frown, did not ask. People think silence is a weakness. In truth, silence lets others reveal themselves. And she did, right on cue. I appreciate your contributions, but we need a younger, faster, more agile team. The company is shifting. I trust you understand. I did. The way a mechanic can spot a hairline crack and know it will spider across the hull within months. In her words, I heard the truth. I was being pushed off the very ship I helped launch into open water. I glanced at the clock on the wall. The silver hands pointed to exactly 4:15 in the afternoon. Why do I remember that? Because sometimes fate marks turning points with something as simple as a number. I did not argue, did not defend myself, did not bargain. I simply nodded, polite, controlled. I stayed quiet, not out of fear, but because listening lets people show you exactly who they are. She slid a folder and a sealed envelope across the desk. My termination package. She read the final line like it came from a handbook. We wish you the best in your future endeavors. I picked up the envelope, turned and walked out. The polished wood floor reflected my outline. A man older than he once was, but still standing straight. In the hallway, people I had worked beside for years kept their eyes on their screens or their hands. No one looked up. Not because they resented me, but because silence was the safest choice for them in that moment. No one spoke. No one dared look directly at me. I understood. I held no grudge. I stepped out the front doors. Portland's damp air pressed against my face like a reminder that the world keeps turning, even when something inside you collapses. I stood there for a moment, staring at the Cascade Marine Systems sign glowing in the late afternoon light. Then I turned, walked down the concrete steps, and left the company. I had no idea that within a few hours, a patent worth $750 million would change hands, and that the life I thought was closing behind me was actually opening a new chapter I never saw coming. When I stepped out of the Cascade Marine Systems building, the Portland afternoon had slipped into that drifting chill the Pacific Northwest is known for. I did not go home right away. That is what people usually do when their spirit takes a hit. But I was in no rush. I just walked toward the harbor the way I had so many times before. People say certain places hold your scent so deeply that when trouble hits, your feet find their way back without asking. For me, that place was the Portland waterfront. The steel cranes stood tall and motionless, as if holding their breath while waiting for the next command. Metal clinked in a repair bay nearby, a tired but familiar rhythm. That sound had followed me for more than 3 decades, long enough to become the background score of my working life. The mix of salt air and machine oil drifted around me, no matter how many times I told myself I should switch to a cleaner job. But the truth is, I never belonged in those polished offices and jargon-filled meetings like the one I had survived earlier that afternoon. I walked slowly, looking at the ships moored along the pier. Some were so old their rusted hulls looked like elderly men struggling to stand straight. Others were brand new, their glossy paint a brag in itself, the kind of shine that told you the finest technology was packed inside. Old or new, they all relied on propulsion systems built by people like me. Accounting calls them fixed assets. I called them my steel children. I turned down the narrow street leading to Harbor Brew. It was not the kind of place that served cold brew or artistic lattes or organic pastries. It was the kind where old sailors and engine hands like me gathered, sitting on wooden chairs worn down by time, trading stories that could fill adventure novels if anyone bothered to write them. When I pushed the door open, the bell overhead chimed a thin greeting from the owner, who never left the counter. The whole place looked at me for a breath and then went back to their conversations. It was a familiar kind of glance, just enough attention to see who had walked in, not enough to pry unless I decided to talk. I ordered a black coffee, the kind so thin that if I had worked in water quality testing, I might have sued them for serving something that barely qualified as coffee. I lifted the cup, blew across the surface, and took a sip. People who get fired usually end up in a bar. I chose weak coffee instead. Maybe I truly was getting old. I thought that to myself and let out a quiet laugh. Not happy, not sad, just acceptance. I sat by the window where I could see the entire harbor. Then my mind drifted back to the year 1994, the year I first walked into Cascade Marine Systems. The company had only 18 people back then. We worked in an old building with water stains on the walls. Every time heavy rain hit, half the shop scrambled to put out buckets, and we never had the budget for good coffee. But what we had in abundance was belief. Belief that what we were building might someday put our tiny Portland outfit on the Navy's radar. I remember those early years. We lived on cheap coffee and stubborn optimism. Night shifts in the lab felt like battles with the clock. I had nights where I stumbled home at 2 a.m. and fell asleep without even taking off my coat. But those were the years I felt the most alive. Youth has a way of making you believe nothing is impossible, not if you tighten one more bolt or redraw one more design. Then one day, Magnodrive was born. I remember the exact moment I watched the prototype run on magnetic force instead of propellers. It was so quiet I had to press my ear against the model to be sure it was running. I knew in that moment that my life would be tied to this thing. Saving nearly 40% in fuel was no small matter. It was something that could reshape the entire industry, and Cascade Marine rode that wave into contracts none of us had dared dream about. I stayed in that coffee shop a long time before I finally stood to leave. I did not know what my future would look like, but the feeling of loss from that day still sat heavily inside me. Portland's sky stayed gray, and the fine mist fell like the emotion in my chest, vague yet unmistakable. When I pushed the door open at home, Marley ran to greet me. That old dog was 13, his eyes clouding with age, but he still looked at me with the same affection he had on the first day. He circled me with excitement, then stopped and looked up at me longer than usual. Dogs always know when something big has happened, even if we never say a word. I patted his head and hung up my coat. For some reason, my feet carried me straight to the old wooden cabinet in my study. The hinges squeaked like they always did. I knelt, pulled open the bottom drawer, and took out a worn brown box. On the lid, written in black marker, were the letters IP and the year 2005. I sat at my desk and placed the box in front of me. When I opened it, a thin cloud of dust rose, reminding me how long I had ignored it. Inside were documents I had kept safe back when I still believed the company would follow every procedure. I flipped through the pages until I stopped at the provisional patent bearing my name. Along with it was a half-completed assignment form that had never been finalized. I stared at them for a long moment. My heart beat slow but heavy. Some things stay unnoticed until the exact moment they decide to come back. And I had no idea I had just touched the one sheet of paper that could change my entire life. I sat there staring at the stack of papers in that old box for a long while. People like to think the most important thing in an engineer's life is the machines. It is not. It is the words on paper that decide the value of an entire career. I lifted the provisional patent and saw my own technical handwriting from a time when instinct mattered more than experience. Right underneath it, the unfinished assignment contract lay still, like evidence of something that had never truly been completed. I opened the page marked with a red underline and read every line with care. The clause sat in the middle of the page, not poetic, not long, just impossibly clear. If the inventor is terminated without just cause, ownership of the invention automatically reverts to the inventor after 24 hours. I leaned back and let out a quiet breath. No surprise. Just confirmation of something the company should have remembered long ago. New executives, rounds of restructuring, shifting agendas. That is how things get forgotten. And sometimes the thing they forget is exactly what creates the turning point. I reached for my phone. There was only one person who could tell me whether this clause still held any legal weight: Joel Maddox. We had known each other since our early project days, when I was in my early 30s and he was learning to become an intellectual property attorney. Joel had always been slow, steady, and exact, the kind of man who never needed to be asked twice. He was terrible at small talk, but if you handed him a legal clause, he would examine every period and comma as if the words could explode. I called him. After 3 rings, he picked up. Same calm, steady tone as always. Nathan, what is going on? I kept it short. I am sending you 3 pages. Take a look. I heard the sound of his laptop opening, the rustle of paper. I said nothing. With Joel, silence always worked better than explanation. After about 8 minutes, he spoke again, his voice slow but certain. Nathan, they never completed the assignment. I waited for the part that mattered. Firing you the way they did means ownership reverts to you. The reversion clause is still valid. It cannot be challenged. I listened without reacting. I just looked at the page in my hand and felt the irony settle in. The company had spent decades growing from that very technology, yet it had forgotten the single legal step that mattered most. Joel continued, if you want everything clean, file the reversion notice tonight. I will review it once more before you submit it. Thank you, I said. You are steady in the way you walk. Joel let out a quiet laugh, the kind that barely lifted the air. When a patent worth hundreds of millions is involved, I prefer to be steady. I hung up, opened my computer, and began organizing the documents. I worked the same way I did in the machine shop, careful with every section, every detail, every date. Slow and precise, It was the only way I knew how to settle my nerves. I downloaded the revision form and filled in everything. Every field had to match perfectly. Filing code, first submission date, invention details, contract status. I sent everything to Joel for one final review. About 10 minutes later, he sent a single word. Good, submit it. I applied my electronic signature, uploaded the file to the United States Patent and Trademark Office, and clicked it confirm. One small action, one simple motion with the power to shift the balance between a single person and a large corporation. When the system displayed the acknowledgement, I finally leaned back in my chair. Everything had happened quietly enough that someone might mistake it for routine. The only sounds in the room were the soft patter of rain on the window and Marley stretching under the desk. They forgot to sign one paper for more than 3 decades. I spent 31 minutes finishing it. I did not say that to pat myself on the back. It was simply the truth. Companies grow, leaders change, but paperwork has its own rules. And sometimes those rules stand with the person who built the technology in the first place. I closed the laptop and slid the box back into its place in the cabinet. There was no triumph in me, no thrill of revenge, only the quiet relief of someone who had tightened a bolt others had ignored. I did not do this to get even. I did it to protect the real value of the work I spent my life building. The company may not see that, but the law is not blind, and the truth is not as easy to bury as people think. Outside, Portland was still wrapped in rain, and I knew that tomorrow afternoon, when 24 hours had passed, a new chapter would open. Not because I chased it, but because they had placed it in my hands the moment they made that decision at 4:15 earlier today. While I sat at home listening to the rain tapping against the porch roof and waiting for the patent office system to update, something very different was happening inside Cascade Marine. The whole building was wrapped in a kind of silence that did not come from peace but from suspension, as if the air itself had thickened and no one was brave enough to say why. By the next morning, the engineers in the propulsion bay had begun to notice my absence in a way that was hard to describe. In a large company, people vanish all the time. But when a senior engineer who has been there more than 3 decades disappears overnight, it leaves a mark you can feel on the floor. Paul was the first to notice. He was nearly 20 years younger than me, but he understood the way I worked better than anyone. Every morning he brought coffee to my desk, the kind strong enough to wake up an entire week of fatigue. That morning, Paul walked past my office, paused when he saw the door half open, and knocked gently, calling my name once, no answer. He pushed the door wider. The desk was empty. No coat, no pens, no stack of drawings. The kind of scene that made Paul freeze in the doorway. He looked at the internal notice board, then back into the room as if he could bring me back by blinking hard enough. But the office stayed silent. And that silence spread through the engineering teams like a ripple on water. Some people whispered to each other, but their voices dropped the moment a stranger passed by. Not everyone is bold enough to question management directly. People avoid questions that might paint a target on their back. Paul walked into the propulsion development room. Everyone was working, heads down, hands moving, but no one touched the unspoken thing flickering behind their eyes. They knew I was gone. They just did not know how. I did not blame them. Organizational culture has its own gravity. People have families, bills, and fears about being the next name on the list. It is not cowardice, it is survival. While the engineers tried to keep the pace steady, the management floor above them was lit brightly, as if it were any other morning. Veronica Lake stood in the large conference room with her leadership team. She was outlining the plan for the biggest presentation of the quarter, the demonstration of Magno Drive for the representatives of Homeland Security. This meeting would determine whether the company renewed a contract worth hundreds of millions. She stood in front of the giant screen, speaking with a confidence so polished that, for a moment, people could forget she had fired the architect of the core technology just the day before. We do not rely on individuals. We rely on systems. That was how she opened the meeting, a line that sounded modern, efficient, forward-looking. But slogans like that are usually plastered over cracks rather than used to repair them. What system exists without people, especially a system built on the back of one person's invention? But Veronica believed what she said. or she believed it enough to use it today. The demonstration had been prepared for 2 months. Marketing had a polished introduction video. Engineering had the operational model ready. Government relations had confirmed attendance. Everything pointed to MagnoDrive. Yet no one, not even Veronica, checked the ownership of the patent. Everyone assumed the technology belonged to Cascade Marine. It had been the truth for 20 years, so no one questioned it. Familiarity has a way of turning assumptions into facts. Down in engineering, Paul was assigned to run the data pass for the MagnoDrive simulation before the demo. He connected the cables, watching the signal lines run across the screen. Stable, strong, precise. Just like the day I first handed him the design 2 years earlier. Paul thought of me then. His hand paused for a second before continuing. Some questions must be pushed aside if you want to keep your job. In the office wing, mid-level managers whispered behind half-closed doors. They had heard rumors but did not know what to believe. One said I had taken time off. Another said I had been cut from the restructuring list. No one knew the truth, but they all shared the same thought. Losing the head of propulsion at a moment like this felt strange. But when is losing a key engineer ever convenient? In the fabrication bay, technicians were preparing the new demo modules. Tools clanged against metal, measurements were called out, and the rhythm of work filled the building as if nothing unusual had happened. But the air before a storm always has its own scent. A stillness that someone who grew up near the ocean can recognize instantly. A stillness too sharp, too quiet. In the chief executive's office, Veronica closed the meeting with a single line: "We are ready." Her words carried confidence, but they also revealed a dangerous assumption. She believed the past would stay where she left it. She had no idea that at the exact moment she said those words, the patent office system had already received my reversion filing, and every update was waiting to be confirmed. Cascade Marine continued operating as if nothing had changed, but a much larger truth was already shifting beneath the surface, like deep water gathering itself for a wave no one in the company had ever imagined. Early the next morning, while many people at Cascade Marine were still taking their first sip of coffee, the legal floor was already lit. Austin Monroe, a final-year law intern, opened his laptop and began his usual task, reviewing the intellectual property documents before the demonstration with Homeland Security. He was not the kind of intern who dazzled anyone, but he had the careful precision every legal department relies on. Austin opened the patent office database and entered the patent code for MagnoDrive. He had done this dozens of times. The task was so simple that he performed it while taking a sip of coffee. But when the result appeared, his hand froze. The listed owner was no longer Cascade Marine Systems. It now reads Nathan Hale. Austin stared at the name, convinced he had typed something wrong. He checked the code again, then ran the search again. The result was the same. He did not panic, but something tightened inside him. The kind of instinct most new law students do not develop, though somehow Austin had it. He stood, took his laptop to the office of Adeline Ross, the head of legal. She was known for spotting problems from a mile away. When Austin knocked, she looked up immediately, reading the seriousness on his face before he spoke. "What is happening?" Austin placed the laptop on her desk, turning the screen toward her. She studied the name on the patent page, then zoomed in on the most recent update. Her expression did not change, but her hand paused on the keyboard longer than usual. "Have you checked the patent number?" "Yes, more than once," Ross nodded. The silence in the room told Austin this was not a display glitch. She stood, laptop in hand, and told him to follow. They went straight to the executive floor. In the conference room, Veronica Lake was reviewing the opening slide for the upcoming presentation. When Ross entered, the room fell silent. "Adeline, what do you have?" Ross set the laptop on the table. "The patent record for MagnoDrive has been updated. The listed owner is Nathan Hale." The room turned quiet as if someone had removed all sound. Veronica stared at the screen, reading each line with the intensity of someone who refuses to lose any game she plays. "Who authorized this change?" "No one. This is the result of a reversion filing." Veronica looked up. "Reversion. The clause from the year 2005, Ross said. If the inventor is terminated without just cause, ownership returns to the inventor after 24 hours. It appears Mr. Hale submitted the confirmation last night." Veronica's face barely shifted, but her eyes sharpened. Not fear, calculation. Pause everything. People exchanged uneasy glances. Veronica pulled a chair closer and leaned toward the laptop. What exactly are we facing? Ross answered clearly. If we proceed with the Magno Drive demonstration without ownership, the company could be viewed as infringing on intellectual property. And because the demonstration takes place in front of government representatives, the severity increases. Veronica tapped her fingers lightly on the table, a habit she had whenever her mind was processing quickly. She did not deny anything. She did not react emotionally. She evaluated. Is there any possibility that this is a procedural mistake? I do not believe so, Ross replied. His filing is complete. The patent office does not update based on assumptions. Veronica sat up straighter. We have spent 2 months preparing for this demonstration. We cannot cancel over a paperwork detail. Not now, Ross spoke slowly but firmly. It is not a paperwork detail. It is ownership. Veronica closed her eyes for one moment, drawing the situation together in her mind. Canceling the demonstration would make the company appear unstable. Continuing would bring obvious legal risk. But when faced with a short-term setback or a major opportunity, she was the kind of person who chose the opportunity. Continue with preparation. Homeland Security will not check the patent file before the demonstration. Afterward, I will contact Nathan directly. Ross shook her head lightly but did not argue. The final decision belonged to the chief executive. I will record the warning and file it, but I will not take responsibility for any legal consequences. Veronica answered steadily, I understand, but we will not let 2 months of preparation collapse over a detail no one checked for nearly 2 decades. When the meeting ended, the news filtered through the company, not through clear rumors, but through shifting expressions and unusually long internal discussions. Downstairs, while inspecting the simulation lines for Magno Drive, Paul sensed the change before anyone explained a thing. He did not know what had happened, but the air felt different. He asked another engineer, what is going on today? The response came in a whisper. No idea, but it is not simple. On the upper floor, Veronica walked the hallway, watching staff rush to finalize the demonstration. She knew they were placing their hopes on tomorrow. She also knew her decision carried risk. But in her world of restructuring, risk was not something to avoid. It was something to calculate. She told her assistant one thing. Do not allow the demonstration to be interrupted. Cascade Marine kept moving, but the ground beneath it had begun to shift. Something only the sharpest could sense. No one realized that the update in the patent office system was only the beginning, and that everything would break open exactly when they least expected. The next morning, the Grand Hall of Cascade Marine glowed under bright lights. The company's name hung across the stage, and beneath it stood a scaled model of the test vessel where the Magno Drive system would be demonstrated. Rows of chairs stretched straight across the room. Most seats were filled early. There were officials from Homeland Security, representatives from Customs and the Coast Guard, a few local reporters, and several people from federal engineering agencies. The atmosphere was formal, but it carried the faint tension anyone who has been through a major presentation can recognize. It was not fear. It was the anticipation of something about to be proven. A new technology, a turning point in operations, a promise of future energy savings for the maritime world. Veronica Lake stepped out from behind the curtain, confident and composed. She showed no sign of worry, even though the knowledge that Magno Drive was no longer owned by Cascade Marine was tapping quietly at the back of her mind. But like a captain in rough waters, she believed that if she held steady, others would follow. At 8 in the morning, the demonstration began. Stage lights illuminated the screen behind her. Veronica stepped forward, her voice clear and professional. We are honored to welcome you to Cascade Marine's technology presentation today. We will be introducing the Magno Drive propulsion system, a solution for fuel efficiency and operational performance for naval and security forces. The room stayed silent, every ear attentive. Engineers seated below the stage watched the simulation screen, waiting for signals. Paul stood with the technical team, glancing once toward Veronica before returning his focus to the control panel. He still sensed something wrong, though he could not name it. The screen shifted to the Magno Drive simulation. A small model ship sat on the stage, connected to sensors and a control unit. When the signal triggered, the magnetic engine activated, pushing the model gently forward. No noise, no vibration. Only a smooth movement that made several people in the audience raise their eyebrows in quiet approval. Reporters took notes. Government representatives nodded and whispered to each other. Everything unfolded exactly as planned. Watching the model move, Veronica felt a brief wave of relief. If the demo continued smoothly, Cascade Marine could cement itself again as a leader in propulsion technology. But as the simulation ended and she prepared to move on to the technical advantages, a man in the front row rose from his seat. He was a representative from Homeland Security with silver hair and calm face, holding a folder in his hand. I would like to ask a question before we proceed. The hall fell still. Veronica paused, offering a polite smile. Yes, please go ahead. He did not speak immediately. He lifted the document slightly as if to make sure everyone could see it. According to the official records of the Patent Office, the Magno Drive patent is not currently owned by Cascade Marine. There was no gasp, no murmuring, just a thick silence that settled over the hall like a heavy curtain. Paul gripped the edge of the control panel. Others turned to one another with confused eyes. Veronica's expression remained calm, but her eyes narrowed. She stepped forward, voice steady. Sir, this may be a paperwork issue dating back to a very old transfer process. We are reviewing the matter and will correct it once verification is complete. This does not affect the legality of today's demonstration. The government representative neither nodded nor pushed back. He simply spoke slowly, each word deliberate. A technology that is not legally owned by Cascade Marine cannot be demonstrated before federal agencies. This falls under the intellectual property provisions and governing government contracts. People exchanged glances. A few reporters switched on their recorders. A security officer started writing faster. The room's temperature seemed to drop. Veronica inhaled deeply. Arguing further would only worsen the situation. She looked toward the technical section where Paul and the others waited for direction. We understand, she said, and we will comply with regulations. This demonstration will conclude here. There was no shouting, no chaos, but the unease spread across the room like a cold draft. Officials stood, gathering their materials with polite gestures. Some nodded courteously, though their eyes carried something else entirely. Doubt, caution, disappointment. Paul did not move. He stared at the model ship on stage, then at Veronica as she stepped back behind the curtain with the look of someone calculating her next escape route. The demonstration ended in only a few minutes, but the aftermath stretched across the entire building. People did not speak it aloud. They spoke through their eyes, and their eyes said one thing: something serious had happened, and this was only the beginning. Cascade Marine, which started the morning full of confidence, walked straight into a noon filled with suspicion. And the truth about Magno Drive's ownership was no longer behind the scenes. It had stepped into the spotlight, in full view of the people who held the power to decide the company's future. The next morning, Portland rested under the pale gray light of early autumn. I woke before dawn, following the old habit that had shaped my life through more than 3 decades as an engineer. The first task was always to start the coffee maker. The sound of water running through the filter and the smell of hot coffee spreading through the kitchen made the morning feel almost ordinary. But I knew well this day was unlike any morning before it. Marley, my old dog, lay curled in the corner and lifted his head when he heard the click of the machine. I poured the coffee into my worn ceramic mug, gave him a gentle pat, and opened the door for him to wander outside. He moved more slowly than he used to, but he held the same spirit he had when he was young. Watching him stroll across the yard, I felt a quietness so still it seemed unreal. The opposite of everything that had unfolded at Cascade Marine the day before. I carried my mug to the desk and opened my computer. No rush, no anger, only clarity. I did not need to call anyone. I did not need to join whatever emergency meetings I knew were happening at that exact moment inside the company building. Those meetings belonged to them. What belonged to me was a single email. I opened a new file. I typed slowly and steadily, the way I had written the very first design of Magno Drive. No sharp words, no digs, no bitterness, only truth. And truth, when written clearly enough, carries its own weight. I wrote, I understand you require the Magno Drive system to continue federal contracts. The patent is legally owned by me. The licensing conditions are as follows. I paused for a moment and took a sip of coffee. The conditions were not meant as revenge. They were a recalibration of value, a measure of 31 years of contribution that the company had long taken for granted. I once thought I would stay at Cascade Marine until retirement, but everything changed at 4:15 in the afternoon. And when someone pushes you off the field, you have the right to reclaim what is yours. I listed the conditions. First, $18 million was paid immediately. No delays and no installments. Magno Drive is the core asset behind major federal contracts, and its value far exceeds that number. But I chose a reasonable amount to keep negotiations from collapsing. Second, 12% of all revenue generated from every application of Magno Drive for the remainder of the patent's life. This is the only way to ensure long-term protection, especially for a technology that has become the backbone of an entire industry. Third, one seat on the board of directors, not so I can run the company, but to ensure that what happened to me would never happen to another engineer again. A board without a technical voice will always make decisions out of touch with reality. Fourth, formal attribution of my name on all documentation related to Magno Drive. This is not about recognition, but correctness. The company used my invention for nearly 2 decades without ever asking whether I wanted my name placed properly. I believe the time has come. And finally, Veronica Lake's resignation. Not because she fired me, she had every right to do that, but because she did not understand the real value of the technology or the person behind it. A chief executive who manages only by reading reports can keep a company alive, but she cannot take it far. Her resignation is the condition the company needs if it wants to correct its course from the root. I typed the final line. I am not seeking revenge. I am restoring the measure of value. That was the truth. No one understands a technology better than the person who created it. No one understands value better than the person who spent a lifetime perfecting it. I did not want to tear anyone down. I did not want to see anyone lose their place. I only wanted things to return to where they should have been long ago. I reread the email once. Direct, clear, unwavering. One email strong enough to redefine the balance of power without a single threatening word. The sharpness came from legality and accuracy, not emotion. I entered the addresses of the entire board into the recipient line. People who had listened to me through dozens of technical briefings, who had signed off on reports and proposals I had written, who once called me the foundation of the company, and who stayed silent when I was removed from a meeting I had built from the start. I hit send, just one email, but in the corporate world, a properly written and legally sound document can shake the highest seats more than any speech. I knew that within minutes the board would receive the message. They would read it, they would discuss it. Some would be surprised, some irritated, some would sigh, feeling they had seen this coming but never admitted it. I leaned back as Marley ran in circles across the yard, as if he too sensed something had just shifted. At Cascade Marine, everything was likely spinning in ways no one anticipated. At my home, everything stayed quiet. My coffee had cooled halfway, but its taste was still as strong as the moment it was poured. The truth is, I did not want anyone to lose their job. I did not want the company to fall. But I had been pushed out of a door I helped build. And when that happens, there are two choices. Step back forever or reclaim the foundation you created. I chose the most reasonable path. The email was sent. What happened next belonged to them. My part was simply to wait. The failed demonstration left a strange emptiness inside the Cascade Marine building. There was no shouting and no frantic scrambling, the way people imagine a company in crisis might react. What settled over the hallways was a heavy stillness, as if the entire building were holding a single shared breath. The first emergency meeting began only 30 minutes after the officials walked out of the auditorium. The board sat around a long cherry wood table, each person with a printed copy of my email in front of them. No one spoke immediately. They read, looked at one another, then looked back down as if every sentence held a hidden threat. Veronica stood at the end of the table rather than sitting. Her arms were crossed, her chin lifted as if trying to hold on to whatever authority she had left. But anyone watching could see she was no longer in control. Near the head of the table sat Arthur Briggs, the head of operations. Arthur was in his early 50s with silver hair, a face that always looked as though he had just stepped out of an important meeting. He was not loud, yet he had a way of being present at the exact moment power shifted, without announcing himself. People like Arthur exist in every company, always close to authority, never fighting for it openly, yet never missing an opportunity. The meeting began when the chairwoman, Marjorie Kemp, set the papers down and said, "We have a serious problem." No one disagreed. Arthur leaned forward slightly, fingers interlaced on the table, eyes fixed on the document. "First is the litigation risk," Arthur said. "If Nathan chooses to act, he can sue us for willful infringement of intellectual property. And the fact that the demo happened in front of federal officials makes it far worse." Veronica spoke quickly, her voice trying to keep its composure. "This is a paperwork irregularity. We can renegotiate." Arthur did not look at her. His tone stayed steady. "I am not talking about negotiation. I am talking about the possibility of an investigation. The department will not overlook this." Chairwoman Kemp nodded. "Next is contract damage. Without the Magno Drive demonstration, we lose a competitive advantage. Partners will question our reliability." Another board member added, "And our public image. Reporters have already contacted communications. They want to know why the patent is in private hands." Veronica pressed her palms to the table. "Nathan is not just anyone, he is ours. I believe I can speak to him more cooperatively." Arthur finally turned his head toward her, meeting her eyes for the first time. "If you wanted to speak to him, you should have done so before firing him." The room went silent. Veronica tightened her lips but made no rebuttal. Everyone understood the same unspoken truth. Firing me had not been unethical. It had been strategically foolish. Chairwoman Kemp continued. "Nathan presented 5 conditions, none of them is small, but without accepting them, we lose the entire value of Magno Drive." Another member said $18 million, 12% revenue, a board seat, proper attribution, and the chief executive must step down. Arthur flipped the document over as if to underline that nothing in this discussion was vague. "Given the situation, I find those terms reasonable," he said. The entire room turned toward Arthur. Veronica stared at him, disbelief sharp in her eyes. "What are you saying?" she asked. Arthur's expression never shifted. A chief executive must be accountable when risk comes directly from their own decision. Firing the inventor without verifying the legal status of the patent was a mistake, and we are now paying for it. Veronica shook her head, her voice low as she tried to steady herself. "I did what was necessary for the company. Nathan is no longer aligned with the new direction. I cannot rely on one person forever." Arthur answered softly, but the line cut sharply. "A new direction cannot be built on removing the person who holds the key to the core technology." Chairwoman Kemp intervened quickly, worried the exchange would escalate. "Let us remain calm. We are not here to judge individuals. We are here to save the company." But her next sentence landed like a verdict. "There is no other choice." A deep silence fell over the room. Arthur placed the papers neatly back into the center of the table as if marking the end of the argument. "We accept all of Nathan's conditions," Chairwoman Kemp said. A board member wrote the decision into the minutes. Another adjusted his glasses. Veronica stood frozen, as though her feet had been fixed to the floor. Finally, someone voiced the thought everyone had been avoiding. "The last condition means Veronica must step down. No objections, no defenders' rows, no dramatic scenes. Just the quiet acceptance of people staring at consequences they could no longer escape." Veronica looked around the room. The same people who shook her hand on her first day now avoided her eyes. The same people who once said she would elevate the company now kept staring at their papers, as if the documents mattered more than the woman standing before them. Her fall made no sound. No chair overturned, no shouting, no tears, only a fax sealed by an email and a failed demonstration. "I will arrange the handover," she said quietly. She turned and walked out, each step slow and measured, revealing a truth no one wanted to admit. Sometimes the end does not come from a grand mistake, but from a small detail forgotten for nearly 2 decades. Arthur watched her go, his face unreadable. Some believed he had won. Others thought he had simply followed the strongest win. No matter the reason, the chief executive's seat had shifted. And it cleared the path for the next step in Cascade Marine's future, a step they could not control anymore, because the power now lay with the one person they assumed would never leave, Nathan Hale. The meeting ended in silence, but it was not the silence of ending. It was the silence of a new chapter rising. And every person in that room understood they were no longer the ones steering the story. I returned to Cascade Marine on a clear morning, the wind from the harbor carrying the familiar salt in the air. This time I did not walk through the employee gate, did not wear my engineer badge, and did not stop by the shop floor to hear the steel striking the way I had for more than 3 decades. I went straight to the top floor, to the boardroom under a new title, board member, a position I had never imagined for myself and never dreamed of. But life has ways of shifting quietly, in directions even the person living it cannot predict. When I stepped into the room, a few people stood to greet me. No applause, no flattery, just a steady respect, and perhaps a touch of gratitude. I nodded and walked to the chair prepared for me. Marley walked beside me, his tail flicking gently, taking slow steps as if he knew I was no longer the engineer who had been pushed out. I sat down. Marley settled at my feet, resting his head against the corner of the rug, a peaceful picture in a room that had witnessed countless tense meetings. I placed a hand on his back, feeling the warmth through his aging coat. In that moment, I looked around the room. Faces I had worked with for years, people who had relied on the technology I created, people who had stayed silent when I was shown the door. Now those same faces looked at me differently, not because I had won anything, but because truth had forced them to recalibrate. I felt no triumph, no reason for it. None of this had been about winning or losing. It was simply a correction long overdue. When the meeting ended, people drifted out. Paul stood by the doorway watching me for a long moment, as if battling with words he had carried inside him for too long. Finally, he stepped closer, his voice low and slightly rough. That day, when they fired you, I am sorry I did not do anything. I looked at him and saw a real regret in his eyes. Not fear of me, not an obligation, just the weight of knowing his silence had carved a small mark inside himself. I answered softly without blame. Paul, no one is required to stand up before they are ready. What matters is the way you choose to live after. He nodded, stepping back as if a burden had been lifted. I walked into my new office. The room had a glass wall overlooking the harbor. Even from higher up, even farther away, I could still hear the cranes and the waves, just enough to remind me where I started. I stood there for a long time looking out at the water. More than 3 decades. People may forget to sign papers, but real value does not disappear. I thought of the people listening to this story, people who have lived through many seasons, who have built things big or small, each carrying a piece of themselves. At a certain age, you realize it is not that you have grown weaker. It is that the world around you has forgotten your worth, and sometimes you need to remind it. I sat down. Marley shifted positions, stretching out as if he too felt that everything had finally returned to where it belonged. The midday light fell across the room, glinting off the documents for a new project on my desk. I picked them up, feeling the old familiarity, like lifting a blueprint from years ago. No anger, no resentment, only work. And the quiet assurance that this time, everything stood in its rightful place. Before closing this chapter, I want to speak directly to those listening, especially the older ones who have spent a lifetime building something. Each of us has a magno drive of our own, something we have poured time, strength, passion, and heart into. Do not let anyone diminish it. Do not let anyone decide the value of what you have carried your whole life. There are moments when you must rise and put everything back in its proper place. Not loudly, not angrily, just with the calm certainty of someone who knows their true worth. If you would like to hear more stories told with this same quiet sharpness, please subscribe to the channel. I deeply appreciate your presence here. Thank you for staying until the end.